there are two main factors that I would point to in kind of the resurgence of memory and history in politics and in European politics in particular. I think the first is obviously the end of the Cold War in 1989, because I think the Cold War really froze a lot of historical conflicts in place. It's sort of these kind of conflicts about history and memory really took a back seat to the various proxy wars that the US and the Soviet Union were fighting, and took a backseat to the kind of broader ideological battle. And so a lot of those kind of conflicts were repressed, and the kind of counter memories of these kind of mnemonic battles that we see today were really repressed by the ideological battle of the Cold War. So I think that's the first major factor. And then I think the reason we're seeing so much of this in Europe right now, and in particular in sort of East Central Europe, is I think really kind of the end of the accession process to the EU. A lot of these kind of, if you look at the kind of illiberal regimes that are passing memory laws in East Central Europe, right, places like Hungary and Poland in particular, but these kind of things are happening in my native Slovenia as well as in Czechia and in other places. These are countries that all entered the EU in 2004 on the 1st of May in that kind of first wave of accession from post-communist Europe. And right now, I think sort of after the accession of Croatia and then Bulgaria and Romania, we've kind of really come to the end of the major wave of accession to the EU from post-communist Europe. And I think sort of accession and that whole process of kind of catching up and joining the EU, it really in some ways acted as what Adam Michnik referred to as a refrigerator, right? It kept those frozen conflicts of the Cold War, maybe took them out of the freezer and put them in the refrigerator, as kind of parties across the political spectrum really saw entry into the EU as a path to modernization, to democratization, to capitalism, and as kind of a necessary step. So the kind of ideological battles and the battles about the past, about the meaning of the past, about the meaning of the pre-communist past, and what that meant, those were kind of took a second place to the kind of imitation game, or this kind of nachholende Revolution, right? The catch-up revolution, as Habermas called it. And I think sort of once that was achieved, once sort of all these nations joined the acquis communautaire, right, took over the legal framework of the EU and became full members, then they felt confident enough to sort of start to really engage with their own past and to think about how the historical lessons of their past, of communism, perhaps differed from the historical lessons that most of the Western nations in the EU have, which are based much more around the defeat of fascism in 1945, and then the subsequent kind of revelation and entry of the Holocaust, which became really, Tony Judd, I think, described it best, this kind of entry ticket, European entry ticket. And I think sort of, as I said, once they became full members, the member states from post-communist Europe started to really enter into those debates in the European Parliament, in the institutions, in their own national governments, in a way that really wasn't possible before, because before they were really interested in imitating the EU and becoming members. So I think those are kind of the two key things. In global politics, the end of the Cold War, and then in European politics, accession into the EU and the kind of, I think, renewed energy and confidence that gave post-communist member states to sort of start to talk about these things. I think the major fault lines really lie in sort of what the crucial events of the past are taken to be, and the lessons that sort of politicians and other memory entrepreneurs draw from them, right? So if you look at kind of the formation of the EU, of the Council of Europe, and of kind of the whole international system in Western Europe, it's based on the idea of human rights. It's based on the idea that democracy is liberal democracy. Democracy is, it must protect, right, the human dignity of every individual, right, as is stated right up front in the basic law that the Allies kind of forced upon West Germany. And it's the idea that there are certain rights that cannot be overturned by majority rule, right? There are certain things democracies cannot vote to abolish. And I think that idea really comes from the experience of fascism, and particularly the lessons that Western Europe drew from the Holocaust, right? And we have a lot of historical research on this from people like Tony Judd, like Timothy Snyder, right, who talk about how the killing of the juridical person, right, this idea that you take away someone's citizenship, you take away their name, you give them a number, and it's much easier to sort of annihilate a number than it is to kill a person with citizenship, with a name, with birth, with documents, right? And so the idea there was there are certain rights that cannot be taken away, and that is what it means to be democratic. It is to protect those rights at both the national level, through constitutions, through courts, and also supranationally, whether that's through the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, whether that's through various monitoring mechanisms developed through the EU and other international organizations, right? That was rights protection, was really at the core of kind of the lessons from that Western Europe drew from 1945. I think what we see in sort of East Central Europe is a very different set of lessons that are drawn from the kind of more critical historical experience of communism, or of 1989, to speak in kind of with a symbolic date as a shorthand. And those lessons are very different, right? I mean, clearly communist regimes violated rights in all sorts of ways. But I think for most people living in those societies, the primary experience was one of a loss of control, a loss of domestic control in particular. Especially for those countries within the Warsaw Pact, there was a sense that yes, while there were local collaborators, while there was a local communist party, most of the big things were happening in Moscow and dictates coming from Moscow, right? It's there's some of that is revisionist history that makes it easier for former communists to sort of say it wasn't really our fault and to pretend that they're now Democrats. But a lot of it's actually true, right? And you need to think of nothing else than sort of the various uprisings that were put down by the Red Army, right, in Prague and Budapest and elsewhere over the course of sort of the 45 years of communist domination of East Central Europe. And so I think with that experience, there's a sense that democracy is not really about rights protection. Democracy is about domestic control, right? It's about kind of majoritarianism. It's about sort of state sovereignty. So that's one aspect that I think is different. The other, I think, is the relationship to nationalism. If you look at kind of the Western European narrative, it's much more about the dangers of bloody nationalism, right? If you look at kind of the founders of the EU, they always talk about the dangers of nationalism and where it led us. And that's really seen as something that's what you can't be. You can't be a nationalist. And Hannah Arendt has a wonderful phrase where she talks about the nation state, that hyphenated concept, as being kind of not stable, but being a battleground, where the nation, right, which is particular, which has ethnic groups where some are more equal than others, is battling against the state as this idea of equal rule for everyone, rule of law, right, where citizenship and nationality doesn't matter. And in Western Europe, you see the state dominating the nation, right, as a result of the experience and the lessons drawn from communism. On the other hand, in post-communist Europe, the nation doesn't have that kind of negative appeal. In fact, the nation was a source of resistance to the kind of internationalist movement of communism and to this outside domination, right, the rule from Moscow. And I think as a result of that, and of the fact that most of the dissidents were nationalists and writers writing in the vernacular language, right, in the local language, it means that the nation is seen as a source of resistance and as a source of liberation. So I think if you combine that with the emphasis that post-communist states place on kind of state sovereignty, you come to national sovereignty as being crucial. And I think that's what you're seeing being expressed in kind of illiberal democracy, right? These are democracies that emphasize the nation and that emphasize majoritarianism over kind of the liberal protection of rights. And I think that they're democracies where in some ways the nation has conquered the state rather than the state conquering the nation, to speak in kind of Arendtian terms. And I think that that's really kind of the source of this key difference that we see today. And it's also, I think, crucially the source of why you see people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, like Duda and the rest of the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and people like Janez Janša here in Slovenia, speaking about Brussels as the new Moscow, right? That's a very powerful trope for kind of East European post-communist member states, and it's a very effective form of politics. The EU has tried to do some things on this front, right? So there have been a number of reports coming together. There's now a EU holiday in August, a day of remembrance of all kind of totalitarian regimes. That's an attempt to kind of bring these two narratives together. But I don't think that that's been very successful. What would be necessary for this to work? I think the only way to really make this work is you can't just do it in the institutions. You can't just do this in Brussels. You can't do it through the House of European History and kind of this attempt to create an overarching narrative sort of from the center out or from the top down. I don't think that's going to work. I think the only way to do this is to have kind of an open conversation in across transnational or cross-border European public sphere, and to really have these kind of debates out in the open and to have them done in a way that's not purely strategic or instrumental, right, for politicians to sort of mobilize their bases, but to actually have it as a constructive debate where everybody is sort of actually trying to come to an understanding, where everybody is actually sort of openly putting their cards on the table, and sort of having a real debate about what the past means beyond kind of electoral considerations or monetary considerations, right? If you think about sort of historical injustices. So I think that's what's really necessary. Again, I don't think that's an easy task. And I think sort of the difficulty of that task, I think, is seen most clearly in the example of Germany today, because Germany kind of is an example in miniature, given that sort of you have these kind of internal debates between the kind of Western narrative and the Eastern narrative between Western and Eastern Germans. And that distinction, I think, is still very much present. You see it in very different voting patterns from Western to Eastern Germany. Support for the far right is much higher in Eastern Germany. Pushback against sort of migrants and asylum seekers is much higher in Eastern Germany than in the West generally. So I think the difficulty that Germans have had in kind of having this conversation already points to the difficulties Europe will have. I think there are some lessons from the German experience as well, though, right? So for instance, what you saw in Germany was basically, it wasn't a merging of two societies or of two states. It was really a Western takeover. And that's true in terms of the public sphere. That's true in terms of major media. If you think about the major media in Germany today, right? From television stations to newspapers like the FAZ, like the Zeit, whatever you want to think of, they're all Western based. And the danger is that the same thing will happen if we kind of develop a common European public sphere, right? That will be developed through English language editions of whatever it is, Le Monde, El País, maybe the FAZ even, right? And that's going to be a real problem. So I think the key thing is to find kind of areas where sort of to maybe find new media or to really develop a new public sphere that is European, that is collective, that comes from both West and East, rather than trying to develop it from the West and transposing it onto the East, as I think was really the case in Germany. Again, that's a very difficult thing to do. It's unclear exactly how that would work. And I think certainly politicians can facilitate that process. But it's also a process that to a certain extent needs to come from below. I think if you wanted to look for hopeful places, you might look for something like the network of cultural magazines, Eurozine, which sort of has various cultural magazines in all the member states that then contribute translated or English language articles to a common platform in the attempt to kind of spur on debate by translating articles from various perspectives and sort of having debates across different cultural borders. That may be one model. There was a very interesting initiative that the EU was running that I think ended in 2016 called Press Europe, without an E, that was trying to translate various key newspaper articles into English or into other languages so that people could read them and see what the tenor of debates was in different member states. But I think those kind of initiatives maybe give us something of a model for how to think about this. And maybe a way forward. But I think that's really the only way to go about it. I don't think there are any shortcuts.